Hi everyone, welcome to Connected Learning TV. I'm Antero Garcia, Assistant Professor in English at Colorado State University and part of the Colorado State University Writing Project. I'm going to be your host today. Throughout July, we've taken an in-depth look at how the principles of connected learning provide a framework for innovation across different types of learning environments and contexts. In this final webinar of the month today, we're talking with a great group of folks who I'll introduce in a second, specifically about how educators can foster youth civic engagement in connected learning environments. So some of the nitty-gritty before we dive in, I'm going to just give you a rundown. To those participating in the live stream right now, we encourage you to use the chat there to introduce yourselves, connect with each other, and post questions for those here in the Google Plus Hangout. Speaking of Google Plus, there's a fast-growing connected learning community with nearly 2,000 members. We'd love for you to be a part of the conversations happening there. The link to the Google Plus community should be included in the live stream chat, and if it's not, John will take care of that and get in trouble or something. The link for our public group notes Google Doc for today should also be in the live stream chat by now. We'd really appreciate your energy in capturing highlights and sharing resources related to today's conversation. That Google Doc will remain open to the public so that we can continue adding to it even after today. So what I'm going to do right now is do a quick introduction of the other folks joining our webinar, and then dive into what our framing questions are for today before diving into some of the research. So looking from my left to right, on the left we have Cindy O'Donnell Allen. She's a full professor in the English department with me here at Colorado State University, where she also directs the CSU Writing Project. Cindy was a secondary English teacher in Oklahoma for 11 years and became a member of the Oklahoma Writing Project in 1991. She currently serves on the National Writing Project Board of Directors, and she's the author of numerous articles and 2 books, Tough Talk, Tough Text, Teaching English to Change the World, and the book companion, Fostering Strategic Readers in the Secondary Classroom. Currently, Cindy is the winner of several research awards. She's been a member of the editorial board for Research in the Teaching of English, an NCTE Promising Researcher, and Spencer Dissertation Fellow. She currently co-chairs the NCTE Research Forum with me. Next to Cindy is a mysterious bubble that says Connected Learning. That's John, and we don't talk about him, unfortunately. Next to John is Ellen Middow. She is the research director for Educating for Democracy in the Digital Age project with the Civic Engagement Research Group at Mills College. Her research focuses on civic education, youth civic development, and new media as a social context for learning. She is co-editor with Ben Kirshner of the forthcoming volume, Youth Action, Becoming Political in the Digital Age. Next to her is Joe Paraiso, who has spent over a decade in the high school classroom as an English teacher and currently works with 11th and 12th graders at Fremont High in East Oakland. Through the lenses of social equity and critical literary theory, Ms. Paraiso routinely requires students to republish their work via blogging and film, always searching for creative ways to use the school's limited tech resources. And last but not least, Nicole Mira is part of the UCLA Writing Project and has taught high school English for 5 years in New York City and Los Angeles. She's currently a postdoctoral researcher in the Department of Education at UCLA. She is also the coordinator of the UCLA Council of Youth Research, a university school partnership program that engages LA students and teachers in research aimed at challenging educational inequalities and fostering transformative civic engagement. All right, so now that I've blundered through several bios, I'm going to shift over and talk a little bit about the context of what we're doing right now. So let me see. Okay. So as the title talks about, today's webinar is really focused on expression to impact. And there's that word "from" in the title, but what I really want to emphasize is that this isn't linear. And so in talking about that, I'm going to kind of go backwards in time and talk about the context of the last week for myself. So a little bit of context. Before today's webinar, I spent the last 4 days at San Diego Comic-Con, which pretty much looks like that anywhere and everywhere. And my sister and her husband and my good friend Peter got in line 12 hours before an event and camped out with a bunch of other nerds to meet people like the Walking Dead cast and things like that. And it's just a really powerful space for capitalism, but it's also a powerful space if you think about how fandom is kind of emerging in very mainstream ways. And I would just share that Lou Ferrigno looked very lonely at one point during that Comic-Con. But that's how my week ended last week. The way the week started for me was actually, and I want to talk a little bit about how Kickstarter is functioning in these big mainstream ways. But the way my week started was a flurry of anger and frustration on Facebook regarding the Zimmerman case and the verdict that came in. And it was interesting noticing disconnect between my teacher and researcher colleagues and the feelings that they were having, and the feelings that my former students in South Central Los Angeles were having on Facebook. So this was one student that I had as a ninth grader 2 years ago who was posting on Facebook. And the interesting thing is looking at the exchanges in there. His teacher and a good friend of mine, who's currently his teacher now, Mark Gomez, what I noticed in his stream was the way he was engaging in dialogue with young people, right? And the ways digital media and civic education are blending to create this informal dialogue over the summer when most students aren't in school, to really dive into civic dialogue, right? And whether or not that's impact or if that's expression, right? We can see a blend here of both. So a couple of framing questions, or 3 framing questions, sorry, as we move forward. The first question really is, what are we already doing? Right? We have a lot of educators who, by the nature of what we teach and how we teach, are engaged in civic engagement, right? So I don't want us to think about the next hour as a space where what we've been doing is something new and we're kind of bringing in a new era of things. I want to recognize the powerful strategies and practices that are already happening in classrooms. But related to that, we know that culturally things have been shifting a lot. And so what I want to do is have us think through, how is the context of what we're doing in classrooms changing? How is the context of organizing changing and adapting to technological shifts, to cultural shifts, and to ways that individuals are interacting with each other? And the final question I want us to think about is, in recognizing all of this stuff that's changing and happening all over the place, what are we doing as a field and as a community to support educators, right? I want us to think about the cultural shifts, but also what's happening in school spaces in terms of standardization, in terms of the way the Common Core has been shaping things for the future. What is it that we're doing and can we do to help shape what's happening? So with that long-winded and again blundering introduction, I'm going to hand this over to Ellen Middow, and she's going to talk a little bit about what's happening up in Mills.
Okay, is that better? No? Okay, so at Mills we've been studying the factors that support youth civic engagement for a number of years, and more recently studying what it means to be political in the digital age and looking at some emerging practices as part of the Youth and Participatory Politics Research Network. And Joe Kahn has done a great webinar on that, so I won't repeat that. But more recently, what we've been trying to think about is what would it mean to prepare students to be not only understanding social and political issues, but able to act on and express their viewpoint and connect with others. And that led us to a partnership with the National Writing Project and Oakland Unified School District to sponsor a teacher-led initiative to think about what kinds of curricular practices would prepare students to understand issues, to engage in dialogue, to express public voice, and to take action towards social change, all with an eye towards what does this look like in the digital age. And that's sponsored by the Bechtel Foundation. So I think I'll just leave it at that. We have a group of teachers who are really starting to experiment and adapt their curriculum, and Joe Paraiso is one of those teachers. So maybe I'll just hand it over to Joe to talk about what this looks like in our classroom.
Thank you, Ellen. So in the classroom, I have 11th and 12th graders, and I teach English, high school level. What it's looked like in the classroom is a lot more publication of the work, a lot more engaging of a global audience, a lot more blogging. So that's one of the fundamental routines, and definitely a medium by which my students feel that they have an instant audience because of the traffic we try to generate, but there are other youth online that are also engaging in the same act. So it is truly a discussion now, as opposed to just I'm going to publish it and then I said it, but now they have to actually engage in dialogue online. What it's look like is it's a new spin on our research projects that all the students have to do as seniors. It's about using social media as a way of collecting data for topics related to social equity, and having that data collection be a lot more real, because the students are using tools that often they use it in the social context, but now to transfer that to academics, being just exposed to tools that they can use to foster that, it really gets them juiced about the work they're doing in the classroom. So a basic research paper now has turned into an opportunity for students to talk to community members, in the case of Mills, with schools of education and all the people that they offer, with just having an audience so that they see that their work and the process of their work is important. And that's been a way that my classroom, as a teacher, I've been able to look at curriculum now, and this impact of the audience now has, and what it means for my students and the work they publish, and how important it feels to them, not just in terms of a novel, a response to a novel text, but just also getting voice on issues that matter. It's been really liberating for the classroom, and it makes the teacher feel that they are creating change, and that the kids are willing to go there. It's just, they just have to be shown like what does exist out there, and how can they use something as simple as their phone to be this powerful weapon for change. It's been really amazing. So the last year has been has re-energized my teaching, and just as an educator, the impact of digital lit has been extraordinary. So yeah, that's been my experience this year.
Joe, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how a student goes about choosing an issue, or maybe an example of an issue a student or a group of students chooses, and the kinds of work that they do around that.
So yeah, so the curriculum approach I take in the classroom applies to not only the text that they use, but also the topics that they choose for what would be their senior research project. We take a critical lit theory approach, so they study work through the lenses, and then they therefore study the world through lenses. We tackle feminism, post-colonialism, Marxism, and psychoanalysis. And through that, the kids then look at, they have multiple ways of looking at a text, at an issue. So there's that. But in terms of choosing a topic, there's a lot of conversation in the classroom, and as an English teacher, you can have so much of it, and the kids, in terms of when they go to choose what's important, it's about showing them that something as small as something as everyday for them as police brutality, what seems like something that just happens all the time, so therefore it must not be that important because it isn't changing. Actually, it is important to a lot of people, if they only understood that people outside of their immediate 10-block radius do not see that. They don't experience that, and there's an audience that needs to hear that. So that, in terms of being able to choose the topics, we approach everything through the social equity lens. So they look at themselves, my student won't look at themselves just as one person. They look at how they represent a group of people who have been, say, disenfranchised, disadvantaged in society, and how they represent that. And then what they do in terms of choosing a topic is they take something that gives them fire, because that is something they're going to be working on for about 8 months, like having a baby. They have to be committed to it, and the only thing they're going to commit to, teenagers, seniors, is something that either makes them really angry, that just raises their emotion, because they can then be involved in it a lot more. And then they choose it, and then there's a lot of work that comes with that. But topics have included things like human trafficking is a very big one. We had one with female genital mutilation for 1 year, a few people, and that was really powerful. Like I said, police brutality. They tackle health topics like obesity among Latinos and its relationship to cultural values. They tackle the secondhand clothing trade, and does it really truly benefit the countries where we're donating clothing to. and then they engage in that process of research, both traditional and plus. So they get to the online conversations, the blogging, the responses, the talking about process online, and really exposing yourself to the listener, the audience, is been a way for them to hone the topics that they choose, so that they choose something very specific.
Thanks,
That was
Joe.
really big. Sorry.
No, I appreciate that, and I particularly appreciate the way you're using theory to help make something that feels very familiar and ordinary, something that needs to help find an audience, right, with the police brutality example.
Yeah.
I'm particularly interested in kind of contextual or juxtaposing this maybe with what Cindy and I were doing out in Colorado, because both Cindy and I were secondary English teachers for several years, and have spent much of the last month working with fourth graders. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Cindy, and maybe you can talk a little bit about the SOS project.
Sure. Yeah, it was a challenge. It was a great privilege to work with fourth graders in their summer school setting the last month for an entire 3 weeks, and it was also a great challenge. And I know that I went home in the afternoons and took a really long nap, because fourth graders have a tremendous amount of energy. So it was wonderful and challenging, I think, for us. And I would say the same was probably true for the students who participated in that project. It was called the Saving Our Stories project, and the focus of the project really is to work with a group of English language learners to do many of the things that Ellen was talking about, but to do it with, obviously, this really smaller group. And I say that to say that we were attempting to help them uncover the stories, not just of themselves and their families, certainly that was a piece of it, but also to help them uncover the stories of the Latino community in Fort Collins, where we live. And I would say, by and large, that though the history of that community has been obscured, certainly as we think about, you know, what is the history of Fort Collins, who are the people that we think about as representative of that history, and so forth. So helping them understand a piece of how their own personal history and their own background matters in the construction of the space that is our community. So we wanted to help them think about some of the issues behind the story that we claim to share as a community, for the purpose of using their own voices to save some of those stories that might not otherwise be saved or surfaced in our community, and for the purpose of taking some action to really be the storytellers who capture those stories and are able to share them beyond in other contexts. So that's what we were doing in a conceptual sense, but in a practical sense, we were doing all kinds of things that connect in some ways to traditional literacy practices, but also certainly are working with composing in really broad terms and thinking about texts in really broad terms. So that meant that, yes, we were reading and listening to some print-based texts, such as vignettes from House on Mango Street and poetry by Pablo Neruda, and responding to those in some ways that might seem expected in a school-based setting. But we were also making cardboard cities in the classroom, and we were using sidewalk chalk, and we were using Mod Podge to take some of the words that they were creating and paste them to this chair where students could sit and share their work. And so it was really challenging space, I think, for us, certainly as people who were learning alongside the kids and leading them in that kind of learning, but also for the kids themselves, because we were in a school, we were in a computer lab, but there were piles and piles of cardboard everywhere, and there were Legos, and there were all these things that are common perhaps to makerspaces that were in this same space. So that was a part of what we were doing this summer, and we also visited some museums in Fort Collins. There's one that's called El Museo de las Tres Colonias, and it's a restored adobe house that really captures the history of some of the immigrants who came, Mexican immigrants who came to Fort Collins in the 1930s to work in the sugar beet industry. And so you can imagine history is presented in one way and certain kinds of stories are preserved in that space. Then we were also visiting the next week a much larger, much shinier museum in our city that was recently opened called the Fort Collins Museum of Discovery, and that space combines history and science learning, and as I said, it's a much shinier space. There is some attempt to capture the history that we had been talking about all summer, but it's really, really confined, literally in spatial terms, to a very, very small part of the museum that isn't terribly interesting, perhaps to the average museum goer, because it's next to these giant things like dinosaurs and tornado tunnels that you can get in, and the wind whips around you at 75 miles an hour. And so you can imagine being a museum goer, you're probably not going to go into a far corner of the museum to listen to the history of someone that's on a very quiet video when there's a tornado tunnel right nearby. So we tried to think with them and to think with one another, Ontero and I did, about you know, the history of Fort Collins as it was being presented and what the kids might learn from negotiating all the spaces that I've been talking about so far. I guess the last thing I would say is that wasn't the end of the line. When summer school was over 3 weeks, at the end of 3 weeks, we told students that we wanted to continue working with them in a very public way, and we're having an event in a few weeks called Making Equity, which is going to combine a pop-up makerspace with some breakout sessions so we can talk about principles of making in schools and homes and communities, and we're actually enlisting the kids to be part of the breakout groups as well as manning some of the tables to share the work that they've learned and also to engage others in some of the making practices that we use together during the summer.
Thanks, Cindy. And we're going to come back in a little bit because I want to talk a little bit about the teaching with tech component of this also in terms of where teachers were involved with this throughout this work and how they're going to continue to be involved. But Ellen, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about reflection in terms of the practice that happens in these classroom spaces.
Sure, yeah. I was just thinking as Cindy was talking about the young people she's working with discovering their communities and their sort of role in their community. I think another critical component, and this is where I think the writing piece and really becomes critical, is that what we're thinking of our project is a set of opportunities that are sort of discrete opportunities. Joe's project is very complex and happens over 8 months, but many of them are shorter, and what we're hoping is not that this isn't the moment where young people learn a civic fact or do a civic action, but they're starting to have their thinking prompted about what is my role in the community, how does my community fit into the larger context, and so they're really starting to develop their civic identities and really think about their place in the world and in the country and in their community, and also to really think about what any given piece they're doing is contributing to the larger social good. So it's not about, did I solve human trafficking in this moment, but how do I discover my civic interests, what fuels my interests, and how did this one action I did fit into my longer concern about a better world.
And I appreciate thinking about that kind of as an ongoing dialogue, and it makes me think of a larger question that maybe we'll kind of touch on throughout of, you know, when is writing a civic act, right? Like when does that start as a civic act? When does it stop? When doesn't it? And doing that as a group of writing project folks, right? I'd imagine this is something that's interesting. Connecting back to Cindy, you know, when is writing making? When is making writing? I know this is a theme that we've kind of touched on throughout the month of webinars. But I do want us to kind of think about that power of writing, right? Which is obviously, as many of us are English teachers, is something we probably all hold on to. So I'm going to uneloquently just pass it off to Nicole and hope she can talk a little bit about the Council of Youth Research and some of the work going on in LA.
Sure. So the last 5 years I've been working with the Council of Youth Research, which started off as a partnership between UCLA and several high schools across Los Angeles, mostly in South LA, East LA, and Watts. And the goal of the project, it really started off when professors at UCLA kept getting asked questions about youth and how they were feeling in the schools and what they were experiencing in the schools. And Professors John Rogers and Ernest Morell came to the realization that people that could best answer these questions are youth themselves, not adults that are coming to see them in their schools occasionally. Youth are the real experts. And so we started this program to kind of mentor high school-aged youth to become researchers of their own schools and communities. So we had a great group of teachers from the UCLA teacher education program that were in a lot of these schools and wanted to do this kind of work. So we encouraged them to find students who were feeling frustrated or who were feeling like they wanted to explore something and they didn't quite have the language for it. And we got them to come to UCLA for a summer program, learn how to craft research questions, learn how to read theory, a lot of what Joe's talking about, going through that entire research process from finding literature to collecting data to interviewing folks, surveying folks about things they cared about, and then creating multimedia presentations about those. So the students have had the opportunity to survey thousands of youth from across California about questions that they've developed, ranging from the quality of the food in their schools to teacher layoffs to the environment that the physical resources that they're dealing with. And they've really had a chance to change policies in their schools and kind of have an impact on the city at large. So that's been really exciting to see develop. This program's been going on for about over a decade now, so we've got generations of youth that come back to mentor the ones that come after them, which is really beautiful to see. The money from UCLA's funding has dried up a little bit, so the awesome thing is that it's become more of a grassroots organization in terms of the teachers and the adults that are involved and the youth that are involved just keep on coming back. That's how much this space means, is that even when resources are scarce, we make it work because it's so important to keep getting our voices out there and empowering young people as citizens. So the only other thing I'd say about it is that I went back into the classroom full-time last year to teach 11th grade again, and I was really trying to figure out how to take what we do in an after-school space like the council and make it something that can be aligned with standards and with Common Core and with testing. And it was a year-long research project that tried to adapt many of these principles, and I found that, especially with Common Core, it's definitely possible to do that. So I think that might be leading into your next question, Hunter.
Or is it? It probably is. But actually, before we go there, I've been thinking a little bit about the connection between what you were saying and what Joe kind of started us off with. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the audiences that the council interacts with and how they do that, and maybe the way their message might change from audience to audience.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that students learn how to do with their writing and with their speech, is they learn how to code switch depending on who they're talking to in order to best express their message. So when they're interviewing their classmates and trying to get them to tell stories, they speak in one way, and when they're speaking to officials at City Hall who have come to our presentations, they know how to craft their speech in a different way to try to demand policy change. When they're speaking to their parents and their community, they're informing them about issues that maybe they didn't know as much about. So they definitely, and then they speak to educational researchers and push them to make their research a reality instead of just academic jargon. So they've learned enough about what context they're in order to shape what they're going to say and how to best reach different audiences to persuade them to actually take some kind of civic action with them.
Thanks, Nicole. So one of the things that's also shaping what we say and how we say it in the classroom is kind of the elephant in the digital room, maybe, the Common Core, right? And how that's kind of unfolding and what's happening in almost every state in the U.S. at this point. And I was struck by a question that Chris Gutierrez brought up in last week's webinar about what happens to remediation in the era of Common Core, and I'd also expand that to what happens to remediation in the cultural shifts that we're seeing today, right? And in the ways people work and labor today. So I'm curious, Nicole, you brought it up first, so I'll pick on you, I guess. I'm not picking on you. All right. Anyways, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about some of the challenges you encountered, but you're saying that it is possible to kind of focus on this kind of work in a Common Core classroom today.
Yeah, if you look through the Common Core standards, in all 4 areas of reading, writing, speaking, listening, and language, there are explicit standards that relate not only to digital media, but also to the idea of authentic feedback and ongoing feedback to students' writing. So I think there's definitely for critical educators that want to get their students doing digital projects related to civic action, we completely are covered and supported by the standards. Research is a huge part of the standards in Common Core. So creating a project based on students' interests and then taking them through that entire project and getting them to put their words into online spaces, get feedback from people they don't know, and then respond to it and change and take action, all of that is completely supported. But of course, the challenge is that, number one, a lot of even though Common Core has a lot of possibilities, everyone's concerned because in the end what gets assessed is what tends to get taught, and the Common Core assessments that are coming down the pike don't necessarily match up with the critical social action piece that a lot of us are talking about. And there's always a time crunch. Testing is a huge concern. Accountability is a huge concern. And obviously getting buy-in from administrators who are nervous about this rollout and are trying to go by the book because they're afraid of doing it any other way and they're not too sure how to manipulate the standards yet. I think that's really where we come in as teacher leaders to show how our curriculum and instruction is standards aligned but goes way beyond what the standards are asking for and gets students, like Joe was saying, to get fire under them to do something that they care about that is also academically rigorous.
Thanks, Nicole. Yeah, and I definitely want to come back to the sense of how do you get the kind of more of a pragmatic conversation later on about how do you get administrators to buy in, how do you get teachers to see that they can do this and not feel fear for retaliation or any kind of consequences within the classroom. But before we do that, I think Cindy's literally in the Common Core right now. Is that right?
Yeah, I'm at a resource development retreat with the National Writing Project to curate some resources that teachers have developed over the past 2 years that are aligned with Common Core state standards. So I'm at a conference center and we've been talking about Common Core a lot. So yes, that's exactly where I am.
And Cindy, do you want to, because I know you and I have been thinking a lot about this because we've done some writing around it. Do you want to talk a little bit about some of the cultural implications of the Common Core in technology and go?
Sure. One of the things I want to point out that also is a theme here in the past few days at this retreat where I've been working is that, you know, the Common Core does dictate some things that you must do in your classroom, but teachers have a lot of power and agency about how to interpret what that means. So yes, the architects of the Common Core may have been talking about writing and talking about argument in pretty traditional ways, but that doesn't mean we have to stop there. That doesn't mean that we as teachers have to think about an argument, for instance, unfolding as a 5-paragraph essay. An argument might be something like a cardboard city that kids are creating in a 4th grade setting that displays the past and the present and what might be the future of a community that has really obscured stories of the Latino folks in Fort Collins. So I would call that a kind of argument, particularly if kids are able to express it in those terms and talk about how the future ought to be different. It ought to be more inclusive of the diversity that we have in our community. So just to say, teachers have a lot of power, and even though tests might be rolled out that aren't going to ask kids to make a cardboard city or to write a piece of public writing on a sidewalk with some chalk, we have a responsibility really to help them see the connections between the kinds of literacy skills that they may be learning and using with these more non-traditional texts into the kinds of things that they might express on a standardized test, let's say, because they do have the skills, they are developing the skills to do those things, and they need to be able to translate those in a variety of contexts. So there's that. The thing that I would say about the writing that Ontario and I have been doing is that we have really taken a close look at the language of the Common Core and have talked about not only pushing back against those standards, but expanding them to include things that aren't immediately relevant or that are missing altogether. One of the things, for instance, that we noticed in the language standards themselves is there's not attention to thinking about any kind of English beyond standard American English, and there's that implication, of course, that it's the language that people in higher socioeconomic status are employing on a daily basis that you might use in a formal environment. But we want our students to recognize the richness of the language that they are able to use. The fact that they're able to speak more than one language is considered to be an asset everywhere in the world except in the United States. That's not a deficit. We want to help kids understand that and feel empowered by that. And there is, but the only attention actually in the documents produced by the Common Core to things such as language that students might use that might not be standard American English is actually found in the ancillary materials. There's a very small document that talks about making accommodations for students who are English language learners, and that two-page document does point out that educators ought to be building on their home literacy skills. They ought to be building on first languages as well to support kids in using both their first language and English in effective ways. But I'm guessing that most teachers and educators and administrators aren't even going to know that that language exists, because you would have to know where to find it on the Common Core website and those sorts of things. And more than likely, you're not going to do that. You're just going to think about the standards themselves and that focus on conventional English and miss that altogether. The other thing that we found in terms of looking at the digital literacies, Nicole mentioned, yeah, there's an awful lot there that has to do with technology, but what we think, what Antero and I have written some about, is that an awful lot of that is focused on critiquing already existing media and images and that sort of thing, and we really think it's skewed toward consumption and critique, not even so much critique, but really consumption and using those tools for traditional literacy purposes like research versus production. Seeing kids as capable of using the digital literacies that are available and the other kinds of meaning-making tools that are available in order to make something new that they couldn't make with a print-based text or something like that. I don't think that's an immediately evident mandate that's in the Common Core documents, and so there are really some limitations there that unless teachers have encouragement in their school context or professional development around in the networks and the conference spaces where they live, if those aren't available, then it could very well just be business as usual in schools, and I think that would be a really sad thing to see.
Thanks, Cindy. And I mean, there's obviously like a very obvious tension, not just between the Common Core, but standards in general, between kind of the financial aspects of what we assess and how we assess it, because as you and I have found out, duct tape is really expensive, right? So to give every student a bit of duct tape and then figure out how to fit that onto a Scantron just isn't gonna work out. But the tension between kind of the financial components of assessment, the time, right? There's a moving timeline. Teachers don't have time to dive into the standards the way you and I had the luxury of doing, right? And the awareness of being able to look at these kinds of resources is really lacking. And I think one piece or a couple of pieces that are missing there, and I want to go to Ellen and then Joe. One piece that's missing is where is the motivation for young people throughout all of this work? And then thinking about on the teacher side, how do teachers get a space to be creative and feel comfortable being able to kind of navigate throughout these spaces? So maybe Ellen, we can go to you first on the motivations piece. And I think you're muted.
I'm thinking maybe I can follow Joe, because I think I can talk about the wraparound.
Perfect. Let's go to Joe then. Joe, do you want to talk a little bit about creativity and how you're using digital spaces for that?
Yeah, teachers can easily be creative, and I think we're saying subversive even with the technology your students come into the room with, and the phone aspect as a tool in the classroom. At the high school level, many students have this high priority on their phones, and when you can engage that resource, if your student has it, it definitely helps out when it comes to, say, we only have 15 working computers in a lab. So when you can support that with something the students already have, and they feel like they're just even as simply just a part of being able to be a resource. One kid lets another kid use their phone for looking something up or watching a YouTube video. That the kids, that's creative. I mean, that's just a way to look at resources and say, I'm not gonna, just because I only have 15 working computers, I can't. So there's also aspects of, with the Common Core's focus on nonfiction text, the web has so much that the students can, because of if a teacher has a broad understanding of what text means and can see video, billboards, images, TED Talks, etc. as a text, then students have access to so many of those kinds of things that they can then practice the reading, the writing, the listening, the speaking around with. But it's online, and it's that. And it's when you talk about the teacher, Antero, the teacher, and where, how do we feel? How can we be creative? Oh wow, this whole year has been about, as an educator, just taking risks. And I mean, you could. There's so much out there and there's so much that the kids can bring in themselves if you demonstrate. This is me going out on a limb. Hey, we're gonna try film trailers. We're gonna try it, and we have all of this access too, and this is what it looks like. Then the kids they will do all of that plus, so they bring in a lot of that creativity themselves because they want to be useful in that way. They want to figure out the 101 ways to use Facebook to make change. So yeah, and creativity is fun in teaching now.
I would just add from my experience, both at the university level and back in the classroom, I perpetually played the new guy card pretty much every year that I worked, and Cindy can attest to the fact that I played it this morning, right? Like on any given day, I'll play the new guy and try to ask for forgiveness after, and try to take risks in a classroom, and that probably isn't the most strategic plan in doing so, right? But in terms of doing stuff in a classroom, I think we have a mandate as educators to make sure that we are allowing students this kind of access, right? Because, well, I think I'll pass over to Ellen because maybe she can talk about the student side of this.
Yeah, so the reason I wanted to follow Joe, and I think, Antero, what you said speaks to this, is I guess one of the things that we're really grappling with is the idea that for young people to equitably have access to these kinds of opportunities, which our research suggests they don't, really requires thinking systemically. So in our research, we see that low-income and minority youth are far less likely to have access to high-quality civic learning opportunities, and we see some of that replicated in participation, although I think the digital space is complicating that idea because it does open up new opportunities for expression and ways to get around gatekeepers. But one of the things in our theory of action in our project is really thinking about how do we take the work of creative and innovative and risk-taking teachers like Joe and like you and like Nicole and build support for a broader group of teachers to take on this work, because there are always some people who are going to be willing to take on that risk or are pushing themselves and are creative, and not everybody gets to be in Joe's class. I wish they did, or in Antero's class. So what we've been doing in our initiative is really taking some of the innovative teacher work and doing research to illustrate to the district when students are able to do research through a civic lens and through a more sort of constructive approach of analyzing issues, not being told here are the sources and here's what you do. They also report things like that school is more interesting, that they see school as relevant to later in life, and then we have some qualitative work in classrooms suggesting higher completion rates of projects, greater depth of thinking about civic and political issues. So being able to take that back to the district and say, not only are we sort of grappling with Common Core priorities and skills around research and academic discussion, but we're also seeing that this is a motivation for students, and that's been pretty effective in building district support, because this kind of work can't continue indefinitely based on individual teachers. There needs to be a sort of collective group of teachers and district support.
And I've been thinking about that sustainability piece, right? Like how does a district support this? Because they may not necessarily know what those resources are for support. And Nicole, I was thinking about what you were saying when you were kind of setting up the context for the Council of Youth Research, that this year it's much more of a grassroots organization of largely grad students who are kind of pulling this together. And what do we get in terms of that sustainability piece? And I think that's a challenge for us to think about, is how do we build that field? I think the Writing Project does a great job with that, National Writing Project. Like the Digital Is resource is a great place I can just point teachers to, and they'll take something from it theoretically. I would also say the other piece of that sustainability piece is, how do we grow the teaching profession? How do we work with pre-service teachers? And Cindy, maybe if you want to talk a little about the teaching with tech component of SOS for a couple minutes.
Sure. One of the things that we did the second week of our 3-week time with the 4th grade period, and this is with the kids at SOS, this was a very intentional piece of the design, was that we offered a teaching with technology workshop that was available to any teacher in our area, that was sponsored by our local Writing Project site. But we also invited pre-service teachers into that space. Prior to even the workshop, we were doing some service learning in both my and Ontario's class to help kids think about developing curriculum for this space. But that teaching with technology workshop was powerful for the teachers involved, I would say, because they were spending their afternoons learning about how to use digital tools, thinking about complex issues revolving around the use of digital and literacies in the classroom. And then the very next day, they were meeting in the morning until lunchtime with those SOS English language learners. And they were learning with those kids, because the kids already had, by that time, developed a lot of skills that they could use to share with the teachers, but they were seeing in a face-to-face way what it actually looks like to work with kids on using these tools, but also using them for a particular civic purpose.
Cool. Thanks, Cindy. We have a couple minutes left. Well, we have 12 minutes left, according to my clock. What I want to do is get to kind of central question we've kind of been circling around here, and what I want to get to is coming back to the title of today's topic, and maybe we'll just go across from Nicole backwards, is what counts as impact, right? If we think about voice to impact, what is the voice in there, and how do we get there, right? What are some of the tensions in terms of when we think about impact in these various settings? So Nicole, you want to start us off?
Sure. The way I think about it is kind of it's like a developmental trajectory, and I think a lot of times when you first get students, especially when a lot of writing instruction and reading instruction has become so standardized and so unengaging, I think the first step to being civically engaged is to find one's own personal voice through writing of any kind. And so I do think it starts with the first civic act being students understanding that their voice has value, and that starts in the classroom, and it starts with personal writing and descriptive and narrative writing. And so I think that is an act in and of itself, because so many students feel that like their voices don't have value, or that they don't have anything that anyone else would want to listen to. And then I feel like it becomes a path that you take students down. This kind of relates to our conversation that we had in a previous webinar about interest-driven learning, and that interests are not simply just hobbies or personal things that kids like to geek out on that don't matter. Young people are inherently and passionately interested in the world around them, and their interests connect them to a larger civic community with the people that are in your classroom, and then also with a wide range of people they never could have even thought of through the online space. And so I feel like it's important to take that personal voice and take those interests, and then our job is to be the facilitator to connect them to making larger and larger impacts along the way. Students think if they're not 18 that they're not true citizens, but I mean the digital space is kind of exploding that boundary that 18 doesn't matter anymore. I'm sure Ellen will talk about the YPP, the Youth Participatory Politics report that came out, and the idea that young people are participating civically every time they're on Facebook or on Twitter and talking about issues that matter to them. So I think that this idea of impact kind of can start from something very small, and you don't need to feel like you immediately have to have the community presentation where superintendents and city hall officials are there changing large policies. That takes time, and that doesn't even have to happen for true impact to be there for young people and to feel like their voices matter. So I think we can definitely see it as a continuum and something that we're constantly working on.
Thanks, Nicole. Joe, do you want to jump in here?
I think that what is equally powerful to finding the voice part is also the part where they find the voice and create the dialogue. I feel that anytime the kids are having a conversation where they engage one other person, that small act, the potential for something that happens in that conversation to go viral in 5 minutes, it can. And I think what a challenge is now is Nicole spoke to it, the facilitating of the audience and the conversation and getting those helping the kids to get those conversations started. This year, I really want the students to be responsible for generating the traffic themselves and figuring out how to get people, if they're on fire for something, how do they get other people on fire for it? So those conversations become even broader, and the students are responsible for getting it to that point. That'll be interesting. That's a risk. I'm taking it. I mean, that's one of those, you know, you can do a lot as an educator, but if we want to spend the time as educators that are doing this work and helping other educators and have an impact and a voice ourselves in a greater way, then our students have to start tackling some of this type of work. That takes up so much of our time as teachers. You know, they're going to have to start doing it, and they can. The ways that they're powerful now with the social media is amazing. If we don't utilize that, wow, that's such an easy way to get the kids to have an impact and a voice so quickly. Yeah, and you can start to, not everything has to be social online. They can have a digital self that's a lot of things, and then to get them to see how they can do that with the tools they're already using. Yeah, impact is great. Very great.
Thanks, Joe. Ellen, you want to pick up the YPP baton?
Yeah. So I love what Joe just said, because so one of the things in the YPP network research, and that's really, I will refer to sort of a previous webinar that Joe Kahn did to not repeat myself on this, but is really noticing that the internet is opening up opportunities for young people to express voice. But what I think we haven't really thought through is how do we think about impact and assess when tweeting actually contributes to some sort of tangible impact versus it's just personal expression, which is important too, but achieves something different. And interestingly, one of the students we talked to in a focus group, but this was in another class, they'd been doing some work with Twitter, and then said her favorite part of the class was actually when they went and did a protest, because she felt like she was actually doing something. And so the next step in my mind is really thinking about the purpose of a protest frequently is to get media attention, to create pressure, which people have used Twitter campaigns to effectively do as well. And so I was trying to think about what happens in that protest that is compelling, and one, you become aware other people are working with you, and two, frequently they're strategic. And so I think what Joe was just referring to is how do we get students to both think about how their digital voices are connecting with others, how does it become collective and collaborative, and to be strategic, how do you get other people to pick it up? So thanks, Joe.
Thanks, Ellen. And thinking about collaborative, Cindy, do you want to jump in here and talk about some of the collaboration you saw in SOS or teaching with tech? I feel like you could go a bunch of different directions with this.
Between the kids and the teachers, or?
Yeah, between the kids and the teachers, as well as between the kids and the kids, maybe.
Yeah. So in a minute, in a single minute, I will try and sum this up. I think that the collaboration was really complex. I think the teachers who were involved in teaching with tech and came in and worked with those kids expected to come in and assume the teacher role, right? To come in and tell the kids how to use these tools. And the kids, they weren't having that. You know, they had some agency around using digital tools for particular purposes, and I don't think the teachers were necessarily prepared for that, and some of them were a little frightened by that, to be honest with you. Initially, they found it a challenging space to be in, but I think if we're going to accomplish the things that Nicole and Joe and Ellen have talked about in these high school places, for sure, I think it's essential for teachers to collaborate with kids, not just to teach kids. Really have to flatten that power dynamic a bit if we're going to accomplish this goal of helping kids develop civic literacy skills.
Thanks, Cindy. Yeah, one of the things that I was struck about in teaching with tech was that kind of disconnect between the space that we had, and I think Bud Hunt talked about this a couple of weeks ago in his setting up a makerspace in a school, right? Is how do you create a non-school space or a non-school environment in a school space? And I think that was a tension we had. We thought we had this great computer lab, and the computers actually ended up being the impediment. They were big. They blocked everything. Students and just naturally tended to have their backs turned to each other, right? And in trying to foment, a civic space, the way schools are inherently set up can be an obstacle in and of itself. So I think that was one of those challenges that I was left with, and how it got in the way of some of the collaboration we're thinking about. We've got about 3 minutes left, and I have tons of questions left, right? I think this was an hour-long conversation starter, so maybe I just move at a very slow pace. But I'm left with a lot of questions, and I'm wondering if maybe we can just go around really quickly and do some final thoughts or takeaways from individual folks. If you guys have some final thoughts, and I'll do a wrap-up spiel at the end. Anybody?
I'll start off just because I've been trying to look at the live stream chat while we've been talking, and I noticed that there is a lot of concern that if these projects, the kinds of amazing projects that we're doing, are not necessarily getting tested, and so much of teachers, especially new teachers' concerns, is to adapt whatever they're doing to the test that's coming, because students' test scores are so important to school accountability and increasingly to teachers' jobs, and so they're worried. And I would say that that can kind of become an issue that we rally around. I mean, we've seen in certain cities and states where people are speaking back to the assessment model and how they're being used. And I think we can include students in this struggle and get their opinion on it and let them lead us to what the next kind of civic actions can be. And I think when we do that, not only does it get students feeling empowered about their own education, but it also kind of starts to create a national movement towards making assessments more portfolio-based and more civically engaging and more authentic to what students really want. So I definitely hear that concern, and I think that we can keep on using our projects to speak to it.
Thanks, Nicole. So if there aren't any other final thoughts, I think I'm going to wrap us up here. And just give you a couple of general takeaways. Before I do that, though, I do want to, something that Cindy mentioned early on, she and I are hosting a Project Connect Makerspace on August 10th here in Fort Collins. So if anybody is looking for a destination road trip to cap off their summer before school starts, definitely come out and enjoy some pizza and coffee with us, and cardboard and games and Latino history. It's going to be great, the Making Equity event. I think there's a link in the live chat for that. So by tomorrow, we're going to have a full recording of this webinar and other curated content up on connectedlearning.tv that you can share with your networks. But this conversation isn't over. This Thursday, July 25th, from 10 to 11 a.m. Pacific time, we're going to revisit and extend the conversation we had today via Twitter chat using the hashtag literacies. Next Monday, July 29th, from 10 to 11 Pacific time also, we're going to be revisiting everything we've heard and learned throughout this month via a virtual unconference format, and we're going to break up into small groups. This is a beta test, and so I'm not quite sure how this is going to go, but I'm pretty sure a handful of us today will be a part of that. So anyone with an adventurous spirit is welcome. The link to that event will be included in the live stream chat, and will be included on the archive page for this webinar as well. So this wraps up our fourth and final webinar of the month, but that doesn't mean we have to pause our conversations here. We encourage everyone to keep this energy going by using the Twitter hashtags CLMOOC and Connected Learning, and by posting in the Connected Learning Google+ community. We hope to see all of you again online on Thursday and Monday. So thanks, everybody, and thank you all the presenters today. I really appreciated learning from all of you. So see you soon.
Thank you.
Thanks.